this, and we are welcoming our guests right now. So, um, Christopher, Chris, I have to say, like, I mean, I think you've had the most kind of professional looking backdrop of almost any of our guests so far. You look like
Yeah.
an academic. So,
Excellent. That's
yes.
it's all about faking it, right? That's what we all do.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. Have you guys seen there was this viral a video that went around about how to in response to that stupid thing about Zoom backgrounds for teaching. It was about how to set up if it were a Zoom background if it were a real faculty office, and so you had like half-used coffee cups all over the place, like papers strewn about and stuff like that. So Chris, you seem to be the opposite end of the spectrum there. So
Pretty organized, yeah. Although I live in fear of what room rater will say, like I don't want plant here, and they're not the appropriate art there. You can never satisfy, I guess.
They did Drinking with Historians, that first episode. I don't know if you remember, Varsha, you won.
Oh yeah, I won. Because I put like a bunch of liquor behind me, and then there was books behind me, and they were like, yeah, this girl knows how to party. Which is basically my apartment back in Berkeley, which I'm going back to in a couple of days. So next week, or the next time we have an episode, you guys are going to get to see my actual, it's not a liquor cabinet, but everyone will get to see like my bottles and bottles of liquor that I've collected over the years, because I drink them very slowly. Except this summer has been drinking heavy for some reason. I'm not sure why. I don't know why. I don't know why I'm drinking so much. There's not a pandemic going on. There's not a crisis with the Postal Service. I'm not leading a web series where I get to drink every week at 3 o'clock. I don't know what it is.
Contractually required to drink every week.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So to introduce our guest, we have Christopher McKnight Nichols, who is a historian of American foreign relations, and specifically his book was on isolationism. And I think the first question that I want to ask, though, is not related to history. I want to ask Matt and Christopher what you guys are drinking today.
All right. Well, I will jump in first because Matt suggested what I'm drinking, in part, a penicillin. So it is one of the rare Scotch drinks. I like Scotch. So it's got honey, ginger, lemon juice, fresh lemon juice, a candied piece of ginger in it, and 2 kinds of Scotch. It's still a very strong Scotchy drink. And it's got some nice early to mid 20th century components, which we can get into and talk through. And I was thinking about trying to rum drink, actually, to get into World War I and rum rations and war. So hopefully we can tap into that in a moment. But so cheers, a penicillin to us all.
Matt, are you drinking a cocktail as well?
I'm drinking a cocktail as well. And inspired by Christopher because, Chris, because I suggested this drink, I figured I should do a Scotch drink as well. And I don't like lemon a whole lot, so I didn't necessarily want to do the penicillin. But I came up with something, or I didn't come up with something, but I picked a cocktail called the Professor, which seemed appropriate as well.
Nice.
And this is an amazing cocktail. It has Scotch. It has some Cardamaro in there, which is a type of herbal liqueur. Some yellow chartreuse and a little bit of allspice trim. So it's a little bit kind of fancy. But I got this from a bar I went to in Atlanta when I was at at a conference there, and I managed to sweet talk the bartender to giving me the recipe by saying, like, I'm a sad professor in Appalachia, and this is so wonderful, and you're so amazing and stuff like that. So I apologize if you're watching. You're probably not, but it is really amazing, and I'd be happy to share the recipe sometime with everybody.
Yeah. I am again drinking bourbon just because I spent the past few hours reading deeply about the Mississippi Delta, and I just felt very I get very patriotic when I read about American rivers, even though we've treated them horribly. So I was reading a little bit about Kentucky as well. It got into there was a little bit about Kentucky, and so I was like, no, I got to drink bourbon today, even though I have a couple of bottles of Scotch downstairs. Eventually, we'll have a Japanese historian on, and I can actually showcase my love of Japanese whiskey one day. But again, I am drinking Hudson Whiskey Baby Bourbon because it's so damn smooth. Just to be clear. Yeah.
There's so many varieties of whiskey, and one of the things we've been talking about someday is to actually talk about kind of the history of liquor, but I think we're going to kind of get to that today, if I'm not mistaken, Chris, because you don't just work on kind of isolationism and stuff like that. You talk about kind of this interplay of kind of the First World War period and the flu pandemic, and you mentioned, kind of as we were kind of chatting about rum rations and Scotch and stuff like that. So I mean, so how does that all kind of tie together? Like, how does one become a history of liquor, I guess, and such interesting things that have no relevance on the world, such as pandemics and American foreign relations and stuff like that?
And then relevant question, did World War II end the 1918 flu pandemic? It's a very important question you must answer today.
Right. Yes, it's true. Since the president has asserted that, we need to fact check in near real time. I'm on it. Glad you invited me on this week. Although he said that the flu pandemic started in 1917 at least 35 times, I think, by Dole's commentary. But in any case, yeah. So really, for me, so much of my work and a lot of the people you've had on the show centers on asking questions, sort of curiosity and rabbit holes, right? Whether it's looking at rivers and sort of how you feel about that, and then what kinds of second or third level questions you ask. So I got into researching the influenza pandemic of 1918 and 19 because I was working on the World War I era and the role of ideas in US foreign policy and domestic politics. And I think I can track it pretty closely to a chapter I was writing in my dissertation on Eugene Debs in the South, and how socialists made these very odd alliances with other anti-war politicians, including virulent racist Democrats in the South, to push back against universal conscription, for instance, but the whole path that the US took towards getting involved in World War I. And then suddenly it starts to be reshaped in the summer and fall of 1918 as the influenza pandemic takes off. And then in the fall of 1918, that's the deadly second wave that keeps us all up at night. And if you're not kept up at night about it, read the recent roundtable that I just put together with some great historians in the Journal of the Gilded Age, or pick up John Barry's book, or Nancy Barstow's book, or Bristow's book, or Laura Spinney, or et cetera. But in any case, in the fall of 1918, when the plurality of deaths happened, the US does hold a midterm election, but it really interrupts gatherings of, say, dissent-oriented politicians, for instance, among other things, along with wartime censorship. And so I've just found that very curious. You don't find that much in the history of that moment. It's much more centered on, if it's domestic politics, it's centered on the sort of over here moment of wartime patriotism and hyper-patriotism, really, or over there, finally mustering US troops to help with the war effort by spring, summer 1918. Anyway, so that's how I got into that set of questions. And I've always been, since I started teaching a US history survey, I always taught the flu pandemic. And until 2020, it bored the hell out of students. They just didn't see its relevance. They were much more interested in World War I. Yeah, exactly. And this year it was like, oh, let's have an optional assignment. We're going to do an extra 30 minutes. Yeah, it was great. So it's another reason when we're thinking about public-facing work, how, the contemporary relevance of the past really does inflect how students and lay people think about it. And obviously it's a presentism that we all feel, whether you're looking at medieval questions that have some contemporary relevance or late 20th century ones. In terms of alcohol, one thing that I found shocking, was working on the progressive era, was temperance. So in Anglo-American spheres, temperance really dominates. But the Brits provide quite a bit of alcohol to their troops, while Americans provide no ration of alcohol whatsoever, formally. And oddly, the Germans and the French have alcohol rations. The French famously have this thing, Pinard, which is like a low-scale red wine. And the Germans do it regionally, provincially. So whatever your drink of choice was from where you were from, you got to bring with you, kind of thing. Certain beers or Riesling, depending on where you're from.
Wait, you're telling me American soldiers were expected to go to Europe and fight the enemy, but were not given resources to purchase alcohol?
They did not officially get alcohol rations. No, because the U.S. was right on its march towards prohibition. So by April 1917, something like 30 states had already prohibited alcohol. It would be, problematic, shall we say, to send them out. Right. But the Russians also had recently done away with government-sponsored alcohol sales. And so there's this interesting thing in the World War I centennial literature. You'll find it buried in footnotes, where Russia did away with selling state-sponsored alcohol and alcohol for their troops in about 1914. And there's this question that people sometimes ask rhetorically, which is just kind of fun historically. How much did that contribute to the Bolshevik Revolution and the dissolution of jailers on the front and soldiers on the front?
Yeah, I mean, if you're not giving your soldiers vodka, there is very little reason for them to defend your regime. I'm sorry, I've never fought in a war, but I'm assuming it's like the bare minimum there.
There are three historians here, and that's just facts.
Yeah.
It's just facts. Again, I've never fought in a war, but I would request, like, you know, a dram a week at the bare minimum.
I mean, there's British officers who say that had it not been for the rum rations, they didn't think they would have won.
I 100% support that counterfactual. I feel like if we study that counterfactual, we would be able to prove that alcohol and low-grade red wine from France definitely helped the correct side win World War I. But you made a really interesting point at the beginning of this when you talked about Eugene Debs and socialists and their alliances with you know, virulent racists when it comes to isolationism. I have two questions that are really important to today's sort of discourse, as well as sort of understanding generally historiographic debates about terminology and periodization. First question, is isolationism still a fair term to use? Considering the fact that the root of all American foreign policy is literally taking away Native American land, enslaving millions of African Americans, et cetera, et cetera. That's my first question. Like, was there ever a point where America was really isolationist? And if there was, how do you actually define isolationism in that? And then my second question is, I know, you know, people might know a little bit more about pushing back against World War I, depending on the books that I've read, but they also might know a lot about the America First Committee and like the huge spring of isolationist movements after the end of World War I and before the entry into World War II. So I was just wondering if you'd comment on whether or not you think there was a clear alliance between people who would categorize themselves as like left-wing isolationists versus those more racist and fascist-friendly isolationists during the interwar period.
Yeah. So those are both great questions, and really rich ones. So the one way to think about how I got into this as well was I started tracking ideas about anti-imperialism, actually. And what I found was, particularly in the political thought of Americans and recent immigrants in opposing American empire in many of its forms, but not all, you found strange bedfellows alliances of the left and the right, sort of very odd ones that you wouldn't imagine those configurations even in contemporary politics. So for instance, the Anti-Imperialist League that's founded in 1898 in the US is arguably the most heterogeneous foreign policy lobby in US history. I mean, it has Andrew Carnegie and Mark Twain. It has W.E.B. Du Bois and William James. It has Jane Addams. It has George Frisbee Hoare, the senior senator from Massachusetts, a Republican. You had Republicans and Democrats, ex-presidents. I mean, it's as heterogeneous as you get, pushing back against the formal annexation of territories against the will of individuals, in particular Filipinos, but also thinking about Puerto Rico, Cuba, et cetera, right? And in those arguments, what I found that got me interested in isolationism was this hearkening back to a tradition of Washington and Jefferson, sometimes in kind of coded language and sometimes in very overt language, which combined a kind of unilateralism, a non-entanglement, and espousing a sort of neutrality that was very optional and highly conditional, but was there and something to be applauded. And so those traditions were what were being updated in the late 19th century. That's what gave rise to a lot of what I've written about this subject as it became modern and updated for the new American commercial military power. Those older ideas about foreign policy had to be adapted, but they couldn't be rejected. Because Americans, so, you know, we see it today, even the left and the right, the kind of hagiography of the founding fathers is really a potent force in American politics. Like, opposing Washington is hard to do, even if you want to pull down that statue, right? Even if you want to make that really sharp intellectual argument about slaveholding, it just isn't palatable. And so too, if you think about his farewell address of 1796 and the injunction against entangling alliances, et cetera. So I got into it that way, thinking about anti-imperialism and those kinds of connections. And I do think, so one problem is that isolationism has been mangled and mistreated as a term, right? It's been yanked out of its historical context. It's used as an epithet, hurled at people who oppose any kind of form of international engagement, sort of willy-nilly in the public discourse. So some historians, and I think rightly, make the case that we should reject the term and find a different term. Others like me say, hey, it's out there in the popular discussion. Let's historicize it. Let's use that interest. Let's take the term and then talk about what it really meant in different eras. So let's find those contingent eras where certain claims were being made and unpack them. Is it protectionist? Is it political? Is it about unilateralism? Is it opportunistic? Is it settler colonialism, as you started, right? Is it about a slaveholding republic? It can be those things in different eras. You have to be careful about your definitional structure. So for me, it's really important to engage questions about isolationism and not sort of ridicule the popular folks who want to talk about that, because that's very much us in our ivory tower, doing the kind of thing that no one listens to, really. I mean, so I really am much more comfortable with trying to historicize it. Now that's Sisyphus-like, you're rolling that rock up the hill, it comes back down every time, right? Let's historicize this. Let me tell you about what William James said in the Anti-Imperialist. But still, you can do that work, I think, and it uncovers some of the surprising ways in which isolationism is useful. For me, I did not expect to find that. So it's kind of a countervailing force intellectually against rash interventionism and other kinds of arguments. There simply isn't another ideology in American political thought that is as potent. Because if you can get people to agree that Washington and Jefferson said something, and it taps into that strong kind of even exceptionalist primordial American view, you might be able to operationalize that in the present or the near future, towards the ends of not intervening, not killing people, not having drone policies, that kind of thing, which seems to me to be an unalloyed good, I'll be honest. The second question was about the America First Committee, which I'd be happy to tackle too. Depends how much we want to get into that now. May also come up in Q&A.
Do it. Go. Do it.
Just to tack on to that, I don't know if people know about the America First Committee. Basically, generally, just to give a summary, they were what they say they were. They opposed the entry of the United States into World War II. But based on their actual official pamphlets and their official messaging, they were never pro-Germany. They did not want Germany to win the war. But what you see during the period as well as after is that not only do they have a large number of anti-Semites in their organization and racists, but eventually there was actually a campaign by people who were very pro-war, pro-internationalists, to smear basically anyone who was isolationist, even on for progressive reasons or even for valid reasons that weren't racist. So I was just wondering how you would characterize the America First movement based on that. Was it purely isolationist or was it morally racist? Or mostly racist?
Right. It depends a little bit on its moment. So I'll give you a historian's answer, right? It starts in summer 1940 at Yale among law students, and it ends with Pearl Harbor a couple days after Pearl Harbor in 41. By summer 41, the anti-Semitism has been too hard to combat. And you've seen most of the left-wing folks who are much more racial egalitarian step back. So for instance, that's the time that you have the Charles Lindbergh famous speech that calls out Jewish Americans. And that's when Norman Thomas, the famous socialist candidate for president, says, now I have to resign from this group. I can't formally be part of any of this. And they've been threatening that for some time, but you see a final wave of resignations in summer and early fall 1941 that really is the death knell for them as making any reasonable claims to having a kind of broader ecumenical basis. But they also are very heterogeneous. I mean, like the American Anti-Imperialist League of 1898, the AFC brings in socialists, Republicans, and Democrats. It's majority Midwestern Republican, but only barely. Some of the mistaken assumptions about it is that they endorsed candidates, which they explicitly didn't. You can find in their minutes, the Hoover Archives has an amazing collection of their stuff. You can find that they really debate this, whether or not they should be endorsing candidates. And until the fall of 41, they finally begin to, just at the very end, just before they fall apart. So they really only have one position: stay out of the war. And then they have corollary positions after that, which you find in their policy statements. But what's fascinating is they too build on that tradition that goes back to Washington and Jefferson. They talk about a historical orientation to the world that needs to be recovered in that moment and held to. It's kind of their theology, if you will, of foreign policy. I call it the 3 pillars of U.S. foreign policy: Washington, Jefferson, and Monroe. You get those established. If you can make that your case, you can build an edifice on top of it. And that's what the AFC tried to do. And they were really, they were incredibly successful. They get, by their own claims, which we have to be skeptical about, they had more than 800,000 members, over 600 chapters across the country, and they never wanted to be a membership organization. They thought they would be a strict policy lobby on the East Coast and DC. Like, they were ill-equipped to ramp up, membership chapters at all.
They started in a seminar room at Yale. Like, basically, it was,
Then
so it was very tiny. Yeah, it was in a guy's house. And then
Quaker Oats. So he had some access to cash and a network of people to support it. But
and that's why I think, I just wanted to chime in here. That's why I think generally the quibble I get from people who don't really do history of foreign relations is that, Varsha, you're just studying decisions by a few people and not really looking how to, like, are you getting the whole story here? But, like, when you look at foreign policy in, like, a more holistic way, you're looking at how not only does it affect, like, policy affects the American public or the public in general, but also how the public influences foreign policy. And I think thinking about the AFC in that way as a social organization is really useful. But one quick follow-up building on that, because isolationism as a term and as an idea has been in the news since, like, 2016, 2015 for some reason. I'm not sure why. But basically, the thing that I see a lot is that when people describe the president's foreign policy is that they use the term zero-sum game, right? That they basically point out that Donald Trump doesn't really have any nuance to his policy of bringing the United States back to the United States. His America First is truly isolationist. Would you argue that, the quote-unquote isolationists of, like, the early 20th century, they were sort of unilateralist in that, I mean, that they believed in using American force when necessary, that they believed in, supporting American businesses abroad when necessary. But Donald Trump's policy sort of rejects the edifice of Monroe, Jefferson, and Washington.
Yeah, so let's go back, let's roll that back in time and then play it up, because I think you're putting your finger on something really important. So the term America First, as far as we know, arrives in the late 19th century.
Right?
No, before. Republican politicians in California in the 1880s use it. You see it in a lot of progressive kinds of claims as coming after the 1880s. Immigration restriction is a piece of this, so it's heavily xenophobic from the start. But in that era, that was cast as a kind of progressive set of policies, because the idea was you wouldn't have race mixing, you wouldn't have competition for jobs potentially. So it fit with a kind of labor orientation as well, which, to the modern ear sounds odd, but the fact that labor leaders were against immigration to keep up salaries for wage workers makes perfect sense, once you spell it out in just a sentence or two. So then as the term America First moves forward, you're right, it gets popularized in the penny press, the popular journalists, the yellow press. But both Wilson and Hughes in 1916 run on America First as part of their platforms. It's not just he kept us out of war, but both of them are talking about America First and against hyphenate Americans, that is against immigrants and immigrant groups. So you can go back to the late 19th century, early 20th century, and you see very similar kinds of ideas that you find in Trump and that you find in that kind of Washingtonian, Jeffersonian, Monrovian mix from before. But what it isn't necessarily is explicitly transactional in the way that we see today. And depending on the figures in the moment, you find a lot more sort of philosophical coherence to arguments for, say, self-sufficiency, right? You wouldn't have high protective tariffs in the late 19th century if you weren't trying to nurture nascent industries. Like, you would have to make that argument, not as punishment against the Chinese. You'd have to make a positive case for why the steel industry or oil refining had to be done. There's a great book by Mark William Palin on the conspiracy of free trade, which is about, like, sort of the moments when this was cutting edge economic thought, and then how quickly you move away from that. So what protectionism might mean. And then, I think the fit with the AFC is an interesting one, because the AFC was, an anti-interventionist, non-interventionist organization. And there's always some blurring between isolationism and non-interventionism when you think about those arguments. And I think it's useful to unpack the terms a bit. All the isms can be a little bit of a pain for listeners and viewers, but what did isolationists generally argue, if you want to find some coherence? One is against collective security agreements. So NATO in 1949 and the treaty with France to win the Revolutionary War. Those are the only two in US history up to the mid-20th century. And lots of quasi-isolationists in the mid-20th century fought against it. Robert Taft, the arch-isolationist who I'm writing about now, senator from Ohio, for instance. And then they also, so they didn't like entangling alliances, and they didn't like binding collective security agreements. Beyond that, then you start to have to shape out the other strains of arguments, points of emphasis, and how they were changed or updated in different eras. So I think the big change comes in the early 19th century with the Monroe Doctrine. As the US gains power, it becomes more hemispheric. And so meddling within the hemisphere becomes possible within this set of ideas in a way that before it was anathema. So as the 19th century moves on, you get a kind of much more unilateralist, interventionist US role in the hemisphere, but one that's circumscribed by thinkers and politicians for elsewhere. And then that grows in the 1890s when you start with Philippines, and then that set of questions keeps burgeoning into the 20th century.
So if I could follow up on that, I mean, one of the things I love about the way that you're describing things is that I think that what all good historians do, or all historians do, is just simply say, like, it's more complicated than that, right?
Yes.
Like this simple narrative that you've been told, as easily as we try to, or as easily as we try to describe something, there's always more there. So I want to ask, because one of the things that we've been wanting to talk about is the impact of the flu on all this. So how does that play in? Because in the midst of this, like as the First World War is going on, as we're coming out of the First World War and stuff like that, with these foreign policy decisions that are being made, I mean, there's a global pandemic that's killing millions of people. So how does that play into kind of what you're talking about here?
Right. Great question. So, that was one of the reasons that I got interested in this at first, the pandemic and its role in the war. And we can get to what President Trump said and how mistaken he was in a moment. But, so the flu pandemic is very much wrapped up in the war. You can't understand it outside the war. And in fact, the war rightly subsumes it in some ways, despite the relative difference in casualties and losses, because the flu is much more deadly. Like the press coverage, the U.S. and in Britain, Britain had this Defense of the Realm Act. The U.S. had the Alien and Sedition Acts, or the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which prevent the press from covering the flu honestly and openly. And so the only places that are really giving news are neutral countries, and that's why it's called the Spanish flu, because Spain was a neutral in the war. Their king gets the flu, so do a lot of the aristocracy, and so that comes out, and then it gets operationalized and weaponized in this racist political rhetoric, right, to call it the Spanish flu, very much like the martial language of draft slackers, like people who avoided the draft in the U.S. Yeah. And then, lo and behold, when mask wearing becomes a thing, mask slackers becomes this sort of martial rhetoric for people who oppose wearing their masks in the U.S. And so we
need to bring that back, I think. But
yeah. Time is a flat circle.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. I've called for that on Twitter, but nobody's listening. So maybe the three of us together can bring back.
No, they're genuinely, like, I think what's interesting is that there is a tiny version of that on Twitter and in certain online forums where people take videos, right? And they post TikTok videos or YouTube videos of people refusing to wear a mask and making scenes in stores. And what ends up happening is that these people, I don't know how they find further community in non-mask wearing, but people who were already maybe on the fence, but definitely pro-mask or definitely pro the pandemic actually exists, see the ridiculousness of this. So I think that's what's interesting about understanding social constructs in a pandemic. Eventually, the more and more people are like, hey, maybe if we protected all each other, this mutualism thing might work, and we could eventually, flatten the curve. I think that's what's interesting about the 1918 versus coronavirus. I mean, I think it's also similar in cholera epidemics in the 19th century, even though medical developments are not as far along as they were in the early 20th century.
Yeah, and I think, so one thing that should worry us, though, is if you think about, this gets to Matt's question, right? The ramifications of that were that, it fell unequally in 1918 and 19, as it is today, racially and socioeconomically disproportionate in terms of who suffered most. There are big differences between the two. The people between 18 and 45 died a lot more in the influenza epidemic, our current one, skews it very differently. But coming out of the war, I mean, that's when you see the summer of 1919 is known as Red Summer. There are race massacres, there's major labor upheaval in the US, there's an economic downturn. And then, it's no coincidence that a few years later, you're getting immigration restriction, massive xenophobia, the rise of the Klan, the Tulsa massacre, right? These all come on the heels of wartime, a wartime rallying and mobilization, and the flu, killing lots of people. I mean, even if you think the U.S. did not suffer as much in the war, which is empirically true, the U.S. suffered a hell of a lot in the flu. And so if 20 million Americans got sick and 0.6% died, which is 675,000, they're living with the vestiges of that for decades to come, in lived experience, even if there aren't memorials made to that. And I think that helps explain a lot of what happens, in particular why, say, African-American troops, when they're coming back from World War I, are attacked. They're making claims of their citizenship rights. And a lot of people who also feel like they've sacrificed or have suffered, see it through a white supremacist lens or some other lens, and you wind up with war, on the streets. Jobs and things are suffering. And so I really worry about what comes on the other end of this. I'm hopeful that we'll do a lot better than that pandemic. But, if we have a really deadly second wave in the fall, and who knows what happens with the election, that's troubling. And all the historians who work on pandemic of 1918 and 19, I think, I speak for us all in saying we worry about this a lot.
Yeah. I mean, what's really interesting is that you talked about, veterans coming home after World War I and being basically racist towards African Americans declaring their rights. What's interesting is that in Kathleen Belew's book about the white power movement, she makes a similar point about the Vietnam War. And basically white Vietnam War vets come home and see what their country has become after the civil rights movement, and they grow even more and more frustrated. And that contributes significantly to the white power movement as well. And so I think that's why it's so important to think about how foreign policy, as you point out in the beginning of the talk, right, or beginning of this call, that like foreign policy and domestic policy are constantly linked. There's really no separating them. Yeah. So should we move to the question and answer portion, Matt?
See lots of questions.
I think so. I mean, I think I could ask like 20 more questions. One of the things that somebody brought up that I think was really interesting, and I should say, like, welcome to Drunk with Historians. The second half hour is somebody asked a very interesting question. We talked at the very beginning about kind of rum rations and alcohol rations and Americans kind of on the verge of prohibition as they entered it. Like, what effect did going to Europe with the veterans kind of coming home have in pushing the U.S. kind of to the final acceptance of prohibition? Did it seem to have any, or was it just kind of a separate phenomenon entirely?
Yeah, I mean, I think historians don't tend to make the argument that the war experience itself, the actual experience of being at war, in the war, abroad, was determinative for prohibition. I mean, the temperance movements have been flourishing for a long time. They were getting very close at the state level, a little bit like suffrage. Lots of states had granted suffrage to women well before, they formally got it 100 years ago in the 19th Amendment. So very similar case with prohibition in the simple answer. The longer answer, the maybe more interesting answer, is the ways in which people got around prohibition as it was developing in that moment, and in terms of the flu. So you could get prescribed very hard liquor as a flu treatment. Very often, one of the ways that they treated troops at the front in the trenches was to give them very high ABV alcohol. Just drink this for 3 days, and you'll be through the 3-day fever, aka Spanish flu, aka influenza, the grip they would call it, and they would just basically be drunk on R&R for 3 days, and then theoretically be back in service. But similarly on the home front, so if people who had the bad common cold, as it was sometimes called in the fall of 1918, could get from the apothecary some very hard alcohol to treat it medicinally, even in states that had prohibition.
I'm getting over a cold right now, Christopher. That's exactly why we're doing this. Matt's overwhelmed and jealous at this type of prescription.
Well, I mean, you know, it's one approach, I guess. You know, as a medievalist, who people make fun of medieval medical treatments all the time. I mean, I'm just thinking like, it's so different. Maybe not. I don't know. Um,
I mean, it was
anyway,
in World War I. It was a cure-all: abscess, teeth, shell shock, right? You know, sleeplessness, insomnia. In fact, supposedly British officers were very commonly on one bottle of whiskey a day because they had such low survival rates that they were just routinely that drunk.
Okay, see, I've changed my time travel answer. Usually I want to go back in time if I ever got a time machine to go to the French Revolution, but I've changed it to become a French officer in the First World War. Clearly, that's
British
the way
officer.
to go. British officer,
British officer,
sorry,
yeah.
not French.
There you go.
Yeah.
Right.
but I mean, the survival rate would kind of justify the fact that you were drunk all the time. I mean, you know, realistically, like you had to jump over the, you know, go over the top and run towards machine guns, like easier to do maybe when you're drunk.
Front.
Like
Officers then led from the front, so they were among the first to get
Wait, were officers just drunk in the trenches as well during World War I?
Pretty often. There are a lot of accounts of it. In fact, lots of troops they had stories of their officers being so drunk that they could no longer take good decisions, is the language they use, and therefore the whole battalion would be lost, or things like that. And then the few survivors would then grab their rum rations and get R&R and then be reconstituted in a new battalion. But thankfully, their officer was now finally dead, and he had been on the 2-bottle alcoholism. And there are accounts of folks who were actually very temperate who got involved in the war. I mean, you know, we're laughing about it, but in the trenches and constant fire, and having to send off your troops, knowing that you know significant percentages will die every time, took a huge toll on these officers, even if they survived. And so there are a lot of accounts of people who basically never touched alcohol before or after, who wound up alcoholic during the war.
Wow. Wow.
Kind of following up on that, another person had a question about specifically about the pandemic and about medical treatments for the pandemic. Is, you know, we were talking about kind of hard liquor, you know, and this obviously no relevance at all to the modern day, you know, talking about vaccines or anything like that, is, you know, what other kind of treatments were kind of available to them? And you know, was there a difference either regionally, like in Europe versus the United States or something like that, about how they treated this disease?
Yeah, so one of the amazing accounts that we have, one of the first stages that we know about the rise of the really deadly virulent form of the second wave, is American and British intelligence officers sending back reports from Northern Europe. And they're watching Switzerland, which had really good medicine at the time. And they're seeing Swiss posts 80% combat ineffective. Because everybody's out with the flu. They're going to Swiss hospitals and finding that there are no good treatment strategies. And now it's not just people are sick for 3 days or a week with a small fatality rate, it's much higher fatality rates. And so the British and the Americans are saying it's not like the beginning when we were minimizing the risks. It's a lot worse, and this is going to undermine the war effort. And so, the Wilson administration takes way too long to get on this, and there's a Surgeon General Rupert Blue, issues all kinds of contradictory statements, a lot like 2020. But in terms of treatment strategies, what they're learning to do are very basic things like what we do today. We call them non-pharmaceutical interventions, closure policies, right? Not gathering in mass, you know, hand hygiene, covering coughs, not handshaking, all that kind of stuff. In other treatments, they eventually come to the gauze masks. They do something that they call ventilation. So just taking the windows off of transit cars, opening windows regularly. In places like Portland, big cities that had their schools go closed, teachers were sent out to teach kind of the home economics of keeping your home ventilated and clean, wiping it down for germs, because they knew about the germ theory. So they knew surfaces needed to be cleaner, or they thought so. But other treatments, I mean, basically that's why we need to learn these lessons and think about them, because the main strategies for dealing with the pandemic in 2020 are the exact same. I mean, historians never get to say that, right? But yeah. I mean, do we? No, we don't. And look, I could quibble. You know, there are some dissimilarities here and there. They're really important ones, but the most substantive ones of closure policies, mask wearing, hand hygiene, you know, how to do phased opening and closing, tracking data, it's the same.
You heard it here first. It's just like 1918.
Basically, I mean, I feel like that's what a lot of people are asking for is maybe only $1,200 was not enough to get us through 5 months of quarantine. Perhaps there should be another stimulus package that actually targets the fact that if people just stayed at home, it'd be much easier to flatten the curve, right? Like, considering the fact that I know New Zealand is an island, so it's a little bit easier to do that, but like Vermont, a state in the United States, has been able to do this. And I understand it's because Vermont is small and, you know, who lives in Vermont, but still.
Vermont. Great people in Vermont.
Great people in Vermont.
I don't mean I'm drinking with historians.
Don't mean to harass Vermonters. Just saying. But yeah, I feel like one thing that we should have learned over a century of dealing with not just pandemics, but diseases in general and understanding the germ theory that, you know, scientists are correct when they say if you don't cough in other people's faces, you might not get a disease. And generally, you know, taking that advice further, stay at home. So I think that's what's frustrating about the current government is that even on state levels, right? Even, you know, politicians you think you support are like, hey, not opening schools are going to destroy the economy. Well, I feel like there are examples from history that point out where, you know, championing public policy is more important than championing the economy. And that helped each other, right? I think the UK is another example of this. They're dealing with a similar issue, even though their cases are a lot less. There was a really good question that I wanted to ask. It also has to do with current policy. So Bruce asks, has the history of globalization generally and like our relationship with the world economy and trade and everything, has it made isolationism as we've defined it from, you know, the late 19th century to the pre-1945, that type of nuanced isolationism, is that isolationism untenable today because of globalization? Or is there like a resurgence of a more virulent type of isolationism that's making itself presentable because of globalization?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, we historians are always cautious, especially those of us who deal with foreign policy, to try to bring up a policy prescription from, say, the early 20th century, and okay, how would you adapt it for a post-Cold War world, and it was developed in an earlier era. You know, if you're thinking about definitions of isolationism too, you know, like we could go through a whole etymology. You know, the epithet form doesn't really arrive in the scholarship and in public discourse till the 1920s and 1930s, right? It's used actually in a medical setting about isolation for measles, mumps, that kind of thing in the late 19th century. So,
interesting.
You know, so again, back to this kind of medicine, ideas and foreign policy, domestic politics, the intersection. You know, I think, so one of the things that intrigued me about late 19th and early 20th century isolationism was how it was grappling with the early globalization. And if you read, you know, there's scores of books, Emily Rosenberg, Eric Rauchway, you know, that argue that before 1914, the US was, in the late progressive era, the US and the world were as globalized as they were 50 years later, in fact, in terms of transmission of ideas, peoples, goods, commodities, right? So, you know, we do ourselves a little bit of a disservice to think about this as the most integrated era ever by some, you know, exponentially different set of calculus. But that said, you know, I think older ideas about the limits of US power are just as applicable today as they were in the late 19th century. The anti-imperialists, you know, could make that strong argument about not ruling alien peoples against their will, as they would have put it. Very similarly to having, you know, 800 bases around the world now with the US military, right? It's not the same as the formal empire. We could get into the questions of formal versus informal empire, right? But that said, you know, that skepticism is easily updated to the present. The other components of the economic questions are really important. So that there's at least two strains, without us going to a long intellectual history genealogy. That there's protectionist isolationism and there's political isolationism. The political form is usually sort of liberal market-oriented views, and the protectionist one does more with tariffs and is more nation-state or hyper-nationalist. That's what we see now, right? But in the 90s, the argument was nation-states were fading away, and so the political form might be useful, but there's no way that you need a protectionist one. I mean, I don't know that there are many reputable economists who buy into the utility of a protectionist isolationist stance in the world, but the U.S. undeniably has adopted one.
Yeah.
So, what does that tell us about whether or not you can buck the trends of globalization? I mean, one president, one set of policies matter.
Yeah, I think that's what's really, I think a lot of political scientists have said this in one form or another on Twitter, but like past 4 years have been like a major horrific political science experiment in that we can like really test things that we never thought would be tested or testable. But I think that's what makes it really hard as historians who've been like trying to look at continuities, especially as a foreign policy person. I've been looking at a lot more continuity, like these edifices that are from the 19th century that push all the way into the late 20th century. And so looking at the major rupture that's happened between 2016 and 2020 is impressive. And it's like hard to behold, right? It shakes you, right? The fact that, the WTO might collapse in a matter of years because of the policies of this administration.
Except you're totally right, but I think you're even more right than you're letting on, because earlier you said how important domestic.
I'm trying to be guarded.
Yeah, but earlier you said how important domestic grassroots kinds of sensibilities are. Foreign policy can't be abstracted from how regular people feel and think. And poll after poll since the 30s, but whatever you think, whatever skepticism you want to throw at polls, have indicated that Americans are at least wary of the U.S.'s role in the world and a leadership role. Right. Yeah. It does change over time. It changed a lot in the early 2010s. Actually, that was when the U.S. was becoming quote unquote isolationist, and a majority said they wanted the U.S. to quote mind its own business in the world. But you can go back over that time, and for me, it's both a rupture and a continuity. Sorry, fans of singularities, but so it's not a shock that America First would be really appealing. It's not a shock that protectionist forms of isolationism, if you want to call it that, just protectionism, if you want to talk about that, or hyper-nationalism, have been really popular and have taken root. It's a kind of, and a skepticism of international organizations has been there for as long as Americans have debated that. I mean, there's some great books on the legal history of internationalism that even argue how hard it was for American legalists to get the U.S. to engage with the world late 19th century, early 20th century. Ben Coates's book is arguably the best of those, I think.
They were genuinely afraid of it because for most of the early 19th century, what a lot of American policymakers are like, hey, if we get involved with Europe, we're going to end up like the old world. We don't want that. Like They were genuinely frustrated and like they hated it. They thought they were better. And so the 20th century, and I think like what you study, right, World War I period, shocked so many Americans. And I think it's like, it's not surprising that the polls show that. But I think what's even harder is to, reconcile our history, specifically like people's history, with how they view American intervention in the world, how they understand the history of all this stuff, and how they vote today, right? So I think like a really specific question about that, which is only slightly relevant, which is important. There has not really been a biopic of Woodrow Wilson, even though like Woodrow Wilson is like the figure in foreign policy. Like if you're talking about treaties and America, you bring up Woodrow Wilson. Like he is like Westphalia, but anthropomorphized, which is like depressing for people when they realize that he screened Birth of a Nation in the White House and like, pretty goddamn racist. But my question is, if Woodrow Wilson were to appear before you for a drink, and like he was aware of like your qualms about his racism and all that kind of stuff, what question specifically about foreign policy would you ask him? Like that's my final question. But like I really want to know.
So all right. So we've eliminated all the racism and all the other stuff, and we're just in the realm of ideas and foreign policy.
Everyone in 2020 should know, and if they don't know, that's frustrating. That this guy was wildly racist, but also he has various foreign policy. He has a foreign policy school named after him, institutes.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Very good.
That's right.
That's true. Yeah. All because of Ted Cruz, right? Ted Cruz made fun of it, I think. Or Ted Cruz made fun of like renaming Yale. And this was already when like Woodrow Wilson was like, we should probably rename our school. It's problematic. The dude
I mean,
was
I think that
basically-
Calhoun and Yale is a much clearer case even than Wilson, who was president of the university, was governor of the state, who was, you know, president of the U.S. But in any case, and is so identified, as you said, with a set of foreign policies.
Yeah.
But I'm perfectly fine with them getting rid of the name.
You know, the only reason I asked this question is like once somebody asked me as like the worst first date question ever. They were like, "Who would you have dinner with? You could have dinner with anybody." And I was like, "Teddy Roosevelt." They're like, "But Teddy Roosevelt hated Native Americans." And I'm like, "Yeah, I know. I still want to know about his opinion on the Supreme Court and water rights in the West." They're like, "Okay." That date, surprisingly, I did not get a second date based on that answer.
Historians are amazing.
Yes, that's the takeaway there.
Yeah.
If you don't get a second date out of that, then you don't want him.
That guy did not deserve it. No.
All I'm saying, but this is why I think it's important to make this a little bit more specific to your interest. I think it's important to think about why we study these characters, even though they're so despicable, right? Like people had a big discussion over Jefferson during Charlottesville, and Charlottesville's 2-year anniversary just came up yesterday or a couple days ago, and people were like really into discussing, hey, should we even give a crap about Jefferson as Virginians, as Americans? So as a historian of foreign policy, should you give a crap about Wilson? If he was sitting in front of you, are his opinions important?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've written a ton about Wilson, and it's very important. And again, if you think about what I was talking about, the sort of 3 foreign policy pillars, you know, individuals take on different significance outside of their own biography, right? So Wilsonianism is a thing, is a set of political thought about foreign policy, very separate from the man. Now, whether or not you want to debate the racist components of that, sort of whether or not he really believed in, you know, self-determination, for instance, that's an interesting question. For who gets self-determination and who doesn't? That'd be one way to tackle this, you know, Varsha's point. Trygve Throntveit has a book, Power Without Victory, trying to separate out the man from the ideology, which is a really good book. And there's a host of historians who've written on this. And you know, one question I would have would be about why. So we know he had this stroke as the League is being debated, and we know that really incapacitated him in making political arguments to advance the League, which might otherwise have been voted on in the Senate. I mean, I could get into the arcaneness of this in the 4th drink in the 3rd hour, but the upshot is that he says it's this League or no League. And so, you know, the Republican reservationists who might have sided with the Democrats aren't going to go there. And Democrats who are ready to make a compromise so that the League would pass in the Senate don't do it because Wilson instructs them not to. So it's very narrowly rejected several times, the U.S. passing the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. So my question would be, you know, why he thought so much that the enforcement sort of protocols of Article 10, that you're obliged to support member nations if they're attacked, were so essential, because he also simultaneously made arguments that the point was just to get the League passed and then fix it later. It's a little like Obamacare, right? Yeah. You get healthcare first, and then you know there are details you need to work out. And he was really confident that that could be worked out. So he made a ton of compromises in the Paris peace process, things that he absolutely, we know, didn't believe and American foreign policy didn't stand for, secret treaties and covenants and stuff like that, all to get the League passed. And then he doesn't make those compromises at home in domestic politics. So I would want to tackle that, and I would drill down on like 6 or 7 questions about that process. But I think the answer was that he was unable to make those final compromises to pass it. But I don't know why he would have been, you know, if we can assume he was fully there mentally, why he would have been so stuck on that set of enforcement sort of elements, which are really vague actually in Article 10 anyway.
Yeah. I know this is beyond your research period, but I was looking into like a sort of a similar issue that happened in the 1960s. So basically in the 1960s, we have NATO. Okay, World War II is over. We have NATO. We also have the UN. But the thing is, France is not really a fan of NATO. And on top of that, a bunch of your basically NATO allies in Europe are like, hey, why is the US just in charge of nukes? I feel like, you know, since the Soviet Union is right next door to us, maybe Europe should be in charge of nukes as well. And so at this point, Western Germany, and as we know, Germany has been responsible, at least according to the Allies, for the past 2 world wars, you know, millions of deaths, like, hey, maybe we could get nukes too. And America is like, hey, why don't we create a multilateral nuclear force? And France is like, hell No. And so basically, during this period, in the United States, as well as in France and in all the different European countries, NATO is being debated as well, but it makes it through. And I think the same thing happened during the UN debates, right? When they're debating like creating the UN. But for some reason, FDR is able to push through UN, and later we're able to push through the creation of NATO. But Wilson specifically fails at the League. So that's why I think you're like right on the money that like, I would love to just neg Wilson for half an hour as to why he couldn't pass the League. So I'm just like, hey, your successors were able to pass a UN and a national, North Atlantic trade organization. So don't understand why you couldn't do it. But I think like negging him would lead to like a really deep discussion on the influence of domestic politics on this, right? So like we didn't really get to talk about that, but the interwar period of like isolationism, big deal.
Yeah, and the U.S. is really involved in the world then too. So it's not just isolationist in some facile sense. It's the U.S. has people on lots of the League, committees, is embroiled in those structures, is renegotiating debt across Europe, but on its own terms, which is why it keeps with that older view of unilateralism and non-entanglement, while still being engaged with the world.
And it's been basically controlling the Philippines and Puerto Rico for like a couple decades now. And on top of that, it's been building trade relationships with China and Russia and a bunch of other Asian countries. So like, I think the point that we made earlier in this is that like isolationism is a very tricky term because it's very different for different people. Neutrality, anti-interventionism. Yeah. Any final questions, Matt? Sorry, I got really nervous.
I've just been enjoying this, and I'm still kind of obsessing about that Teddy Roosevelt anecdote from earlier, because I think but I think this is actually an important point. Is that I think people think that we study history sometimes because we love the things we do, and that's not true at all. Like, I mean, I studied the Crusades. I fucking hate those people. Those people were terrible human beings. Like, but I find them fascinating, right? Like, I mean, we could be really interested in people we don't necessarily like. And I think that does actually, if you don't mind, like kind of segue into kind of maybe a final question, maybe not, maybe we'll have time, is about the question of kind of doing this work for the public and kind of translating, if you will, the work we do on these sometimes hyper specialized things for kind of a wider audience. Because, I know, Chris, like you're not just kind of a professor, but you're the director of a humanities institute as well at Oregon State. And so how do you find that works? I mean, something that Drinking with Historians has been trying to do is to reach kind of these wider audiences. And, we do that every time we teach in a classroom. I mean, that is absolutely public outreach. But then there are these other opportunities in which we have these opportunities to have these conversations with people who are much beyond kind of, again, quote unquote, the ivory tower. I hate that term, but again, kind of beyond academia. So how do you find that when you have something like, you're talking about foreign policy, you're talking about a pandemic and stuff like that, like something immediately that people kind of latch onto? Like, what are your strategies? How do you kind of work with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the first is exactly what you said, which for me, it's a logical extension of teaching. If you're meeting a first semester freshman where they are, it's a lot like meeting a member of the public or a journalist and talking them through an issue. It's like Varsha and I were talking about earlier, maybe before we went on, what are your footnotes? Like, where does this come from? What are the broader stakes of the debate? The other reason is, another way to think about it too is why I've embraced using the term isolationism. I could make an equal and opposite argument against it about, using something anachronistically or finding the constituent arguments elsewhere, using a different term, an unwieldy one maybe. But people use the term and they're interested. So, if they're going to interview you about it, if they're going to ask you to give a talk, then you can smuggle in some great history, some fascinating anecdotes, some fun stuff about booze, while you're at it, and teach them something, right? Otherwise, who's going to have that chance? I think the thing I think about in terms of advocacy of this through the humanities is it's not for everyone. Some scholars are not comfortable doing it. Some incredibly good scholars, aren't comfortable doing it. Either it's bearing their soul or the way that they would prepare or the way that they would be oriented and being asked questions that both you answer. It's more complex than that. And also I'm willing to reduce it to this for you. That's a tough move. And you can get caught out for that, especially in 2020 with social media and other things. I mean, we all make mistakes and now they're much more public and potentially much more inflammatory. But for me, it's a great, I also think toggling back and forth between your scholarly work and the public stuff energizes both. So we're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
you know, what gets you, why you're interested in rivers and dams, you know, for Varsha's, or, you know, how can you hate some of the people you study, Matt, but also love doing it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Part of that is what the average person asks you about those folks, whatever it is, that topic, you know? And for me, then that energizes the kinds of questions I want to ask in scholarly essays that maybe only you guys would read, or some folks watching this, and then other things that are more public, like an op-ed or an op-essay. And then another thing I think is that we all need to continue to advocate for this. I mean, we were tweeting about this and joking about this. You know, people try to pull us down for doing some of this work, even as our institutions and structures also support it, but they don't tend to pay for it. So, you know, like we need to constantly make the case for how important it is to have scholars out there. It's such a great time for historians. History matters so much. You know, the pandemic, 1918 and 2020, it's so obvious, and we're in our homes. So like we can do this, you know?
Yeah. But also at the same point, like, you know, Senator Harris is just nominated as VP, and we're coming up on the century of like women first getting the right to vote. But specifically that year, Black women were not given the right to vote. It took decades later. There's like, it's not just the relevances to contemporary time, but I think one thing that I'm finding out, not just as a historian of foreign relations, but also if you're just a historian of anything, like dams, water, whatever, the types of questions you ask are like the types of questions people should be asking about, like, their news coverage, anything that they're, you know, really doing in their jobs and what they're expecting of politicians. I mean, I feel like that's really important. And then I wouldn't be a proper, like, Massachusetts lover if I didn't bring this up, just because I know this is not in your time, but like Ed Markey just released an ad where like he inverts the famous JFK line, right? Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I cannot do a Massachusetts accent. I'm sorry.
Thank you for that,
so
by the way. So.
Yeah, he inverts the line, right? The whole ad is about him inverting this line. But specifically, I, as a huge nerd, took it as like a historical like moment of self-awareness where like finally a Senate candidate is acknowledging the fact that since the 1930s, polls have shown that Americans not only are wary of American involvement abroad, but are also wary of the American government even existing. So I think it's like, it's really the types of questions that you ask as a historian of rum, isolationism, World War I, and the pandemic are very similar to the types of questions we should be asking about how should we get past this next crisis? How should we live as a country, right? This is a really cool talk.
That's an exceptional point. I mean, I think that's something that animates my public work at the intersection of ideas and intellectual history of foreign relations. Is something that we all can get behind. It's a decent place to land at the end of our conversation, which is what kind of William James called specious abstractions, like, you know, things like America First, but also versions of patriotism that, like, these are often empty vessels that you fill with a set of content, but they're really appealing in the abstract. And so like Make America Great or America First, or, you know, versions of JFK or other kinds of lines, like what we can do as historians, even going very far back, biblical references and other things that we don't know the origins of or the context of, we can help illuminate that for people and help maybe explain to them a little bit why it's more complicated or problematic to endorse that, or how there's a deeper resonance, right? You know, skepticism about US involvement in the world goes way back. And it's because the US has been weak for most of its history, not strong, right? And when we read back a presentist lens, we don't sort of get why Washington and Jefferson and Monroe would warn against those kinds of entanglements. But if you think about it in that weakness, not strength model, and you think about some of those slogans and what they really meant, that's important. And they're sometimes deeply problematic, right? Xenophobic and all kinds of other things, which you don't see unless you have historians to help add that context.
That's why we're here.
Yeah.
And I think, if I can, I mean, unfortunately, I think we're out of time. I think we do have to wrap up. I will point out one more thing, which is that we have 50-something questions that we didn't have time to. About 10 of them are saying how amazing Varsha is and how many wonderful questions she asked. So I want to bring that up. That is true every week, but it is especially true this week too. So let me thank, on behalf of Varsha and me, let me thank our guest, Christopher McKnight Nichols, for joining us. What a fantastic, phenomenal conversation. we had a lot of requests for reading lists. So maybe, Christopher, if you don't mind, maybe tweeting out a few of those books that you recommended, that would be great. You should follow him on Twitter anyway. A couple of recipes, since they don't want to know what I kind of think, but just want to drink some drinking. Like, I'll put out some cocktail recipes as well later. Let me announce too that this is going to be the last kind of weekly Drinking with Historians as the summer is ending and we're moving into the semester. So we're going to go bi-weekly, once every other week. Our next scheduled guest is Sarah Bond from the University of Iowa, who's an amazing classical historian and historian of ancient Rome, who has done an amazing amount of public work. She's a columnist for Hyperallergic, done all sorts of stuff, has been on Full Frontal with Samantha Bee and stuff like that. That'll be really wonderful. We may have a special one-off Drinking with Historians next Friday as well, so tune into Twitter for that, if I can just kind of tease that for a minute. But again, let me refocus again on Christopher, who's just been an amazing, wonderful host. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Have a wonderful Friday evening. And let me close by saying simply, cheers.
Yeah, cheers.
Thanks so much.
And thanks so much. I just want to say, eventually, we should have a speed round where, like, I just yell out isms and you say useful or not useful. And then we'll just, we'll decide how history should be written from there.
We'll get a buzzer. It'll be good.
Yeah, we'll get a buzzer. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Excellent.
Bye,
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks
Have
for
a great
coming.
night.